The champagne glass slipped from Elena Whitmore's fingers and shattered against the marble floor, and for one terrible second, every single guest in the ballroom turned to look at her. "Careful, dear," Margaret Whitmore said loudly, her voice slicing through the music. "We wouldn't want you breaking anything else tonight. You've already broken the dress code." Laughter rippled across the room. Elena felt her face burn as she looked down at her simple blue dress, the same dress she had worn to her own graduation 3 years ago. It was the nicest thing she owned. She had pressed it twice that morning, trying to make it look new. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, kneeling to gather the broken glass with shaking hands. "Leave it," Margaret said, waving a hand at a passing waiter, as if Elena herself were the mess to be cleaned up. "Go sit down. You're embarrassing your brother." Elena stood slowly. Across the ballroom, her brother Daniel was laughing with his new wife's family, completely unaware of what was happening near the drink table. He hadn't seen. He never seemed to see. She had been placed at table 14, the very last table, tucked beside the kitchen doors where the waiters rushed in and out all evening. Her stepsisters, Clara and Beatrice, sat at the head table in matching gold gowns, glowing under the chandelier light like they belonged there. Elena had not been invited to sit with family. She had been invited to disappear. She made her way back toward her seat, keeping her eyes on the floor, when Margaret's voice caught her again. "Actually," Margaret said, standing now, holding her wine glass like a weapon, "since everyone's looking, let's talk about Elena." The room quieted. Even the string quartet in the corner slowed their bows. 26 years old, Margaret announced, smiling the way people smile when they intend to hurt someone gently, in public, where no one can call them cruel. No husband, no proper job, still wearing dresses from her college days. She let out a small theatrical laugh. "I do hope she finds someone before she's too old to be found." The laughter this time was louder. Elena felt it land on her skin like small stones. She saw Beatrice hide a smile behind her napkin. She saw a few guests she didn't even know exchange amused glances, as if her life were entertainment between the salad course and the toasts. Elena's throat tightened. She thought about leaving through the kitchen doors, slipping out before anyone could see her cry. She took one step toward them. "Elena." The voice was calm, low. It did not rise to meet the laughter in the room, and yet somehow it cut straight through it, the way a single clear note cuts through noise. She turned. A man stood a few feet away, tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that only comes from very expensive tailoring. His dark hair was combed back neatly, and his eyes, a deep gray, were fixed only on her, as if the rest of the ballroom had gone quiet and empty. She had noticed him earlier from a distance, seated near the front with the groom's most important guests, though she had no idea who he was. "Come with me," he said. Elena blinked. "I'm sorry. Do we? You don't have to know me yet," he said, offering his arm. His voice warm despite its quiet steadiness. "You only have to trust that you don't deserve to stand here another second." Behind her, she heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. She heard someone whisper his name, though she didn't catch it clearly, only fragments. Duke, and Davencourt, and wasn't he supposed to be at the head table? Elena hesitated. Every eye in the ballroom was now on the two of them instead of on her humiliation, and something about that shift, that sudden redirection of attention, felt like being pulled out of deep water. She placed her hand on his arm. The moment her fingers touched his sleeve, a hush fell over the tables nearest them. Margaret's mouth opened as if to say something else, but nothing came out. For the first time all evening, she looked unsure of herself. The man led Elena away from the drink table, away from table 14, away from the center of the room where everyone could stare, and out through a set of glass doors that opened onto a wide stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The night air was cool and smelled of jasmine. The music from inside grew muffled and distant. Elena pulled her hand back once they were outside, suddenly aware of how strange the last 2 minutes had been. I don't understand what just happened." "You were being humiliated in front of 200 people," he said simply. "And no one in that room was going to stop it. And you decided you would. I decided I couldn't watch it happen again." He said it quietly, almost to himself, and something flickered behind his gray eyes, something that looked like memory. Elena studied him for a moment. Up close, he looked younger than she'd first thought, maybe only a few years older than her, though he carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned, a long time ago, to control every room he entered. "I'm Elena," she said finally. "I know," he replied. "Alexander." She waited for a last name, a title, anything, but he simply watched her, as if her name were the only detail that mattered to him right now. That woman. Alexander said after a pause. The one who spoke to you like that. Is she your mother? Stepmother, Elena said. My father remarried when I was 12. She has 2 daughters of her own. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, the cool air suddenly feeling colder. I used to think if I tried hard enough, she would like me eventually. I stopped thinking that a long time ago. She doesn't deserve the effort, Alexander said. That's easy to say. It's also true. He leaned against the stone railing, looking out at the dark garden instead of at her, which somehow made it easier for Elena to breathe. Cruelty like that, the kind she just performed in front of a room full of strangers, isn't about you. It's about her. People who need an audience to hurt someone usually do it because it's the only power they have left. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. No one had ever said something like that to her before, not so plainly, not without pity attached to it. Thank you, she said quietly, for pulling me out of there. You didn't need to be pulled, Alexander said, glancing at her now. You were already walking away on your own. I just gave you a better direction to walk in. Elena almost smiled, the first real ease she'd felt all evening, loosening something tight in her chest. You said again. You said you couldn't watch it happen again. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, Elena thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, My mother stood in a room very much like that one, a long time ago, and was made to feel very small by people who should have protected her. I was young. I didn't know how to stop it then. He paused. I'm not young anymore. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She hadn't expected a stranger in an expensive suit to hand her something so real within minutes of meeting her. From inside, the sound of a microphone crackled, and Daniel's voice, cheerful and a little too loud from champagne, announced that the first dance was about to begin. Elena glanced toward the glass doors, dread pooling in her stomach at the thought of walking back into that room. I should go back in, she said, though she made no move to do so. People will wonder where I went. People are already wondering, Alexander said, a faint, knowing curve touching the corner of his mouth. That's rather the point. Elena frowned. What do you mean? I mean that in about 30 seconds, someone at that table your stepmother is sitting at will lean over and ask her who I am, he said. And she will not have a good answer, because she will not know. But she will know your name, and mine, are now connected in the minds of everyone in that ballroom. That tends to change how a room behaves toward a person. Elena stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. You did that on purpose. I did it because it was true, and because it was useful, Alexander said. Both things can exist at once. She should have felt used, perhaps, or unsettled at being part of someone else's calculation. Instead, standing there in the cool night air with her humiliation finally quiet behind glass doors, she mostly felt grateful. Well, she said, straightening her shoulders, if my name is going to be attached to yours for the rest of tonight, I suppose I ought to know your last name. Ashford, he said. Alexander Ashford. The name meant nothing to her, and something in his expression suggested he found that refreshing. Just Ashford? She asked. No title, no importance, nothing I'm supposed to be impressed by? There's a title, he admitted. I generally don't lead with it. It tends to change how people speak to me, and I find I prefer knowing what people actually think before they remember to be careful about it. Elena tilted her head. And what do I actually think, so far? That you're wondering whether following a stranger onto a terrace was a mistake, Alexander said, and that you're deciding it wasn't. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, surprised sound that felt foreign after the tension of the evening. You're very confident. I'm very observant, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Through the glass doors, the first dance began, and Elena caught a glimpse of Daniel spinning his new wife slowly under the lights, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness Elena had once imagined for herself, and had long since stopped expecting. She watched for a moment, something bittersweet settling in her chest, and Alexander watched her watching. You're not angry that you missed your brother's first dance, he observed. You're relieved. Is that terrible? No, he said. It's honest. They stood in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind Elena hadn't experienced with another person in longer than she could remember. Eventually, the terrace doors opened again, and a waiter appeared, murmuring something to Alexander about being expected back inside for the toasts. I have to go back in, Alexander said, though he didn't move immediately. Will you be all right out here? I think I'd rather not go back to table 14, Elena admitted. Something in his expression shifted, thoughtful now, calculating in a way that felt entirely different from the way Margaret calculated cruelty. Then don't, he said. Come find me inside. There's an empty seat at my table, and I promise you, no one there will comment on your dress." Elena hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at the garden one last time, at the quiet dark and the jasmine, and the version of herself that had almost slipped out through the kitchen unnoticed 20 minutes ago. "All right," she said, and followed him back into the light. As they crossed the ballroom together, Alexander's hand resting lightly at the small of her back, Elena felt the shift in the room the way one feels a change in weather, subtle but undeniable. Heads turned, whispers passed from table to table like a current. Margaret's eyes found Elena's from across the room, wide with something that looked almost like fear, and for the first time in 14 years, Elena did not look away first. She held her chin up, walked beside a man whose name she had only just learned, and let herself, for one evening, be seen as something other than an embarrassment. Whatever this was, whatever Alexander Ashford wanted from tonight, Elena decided she would find out. But for now, walking through a ballroom that had laughed at her 20 minutes earlier, and now watched her in stunned silence, she allowed herself something she rarely permitted anymore. She allowed herself to feel, just slightly, like she mattered. The table Alexander led her to sat near the front of the ballroom, close enough to the head table that Elena could see the exact moment her stepmother's composure cracked. Margaret kept glancing over, her smile stretched tight, while Clara and Beatrice whispered behind their napkins, no longer laughing at Elena but clearly talking about her. "Ignore them," Alexander said quietly, pulling out a chair for her. "You're allowed one evening where they don't get to decide how you feel." Elena sat, smoothing her dress under the table, painfully aware of how out of place she still felt despite the change of scenery. The other guests at the table, 2 older men in dark suits and a woman in emerald green, glanced at her with polite curiosity but no judgment, which alone felt like a small miracle. "This is Elena," Alexander said simply, by way of introduction, offering no explanation beyond her name, as if that were reason enough for her to belong there. "Whitmore," added the woman in green, studying Elena with sharp, assessing eyes. "The bride's new sister-in-law." "That's right," Elena said carefully, unsure whether the observation was meant kindly. "Your brother gave a lovely speech earlier, before you arrived at this table," the woman said, and there was nothing unkind in it after all, only simple conversation, the sort Elena hadn't been offered by anyone outside her own small circle of friends in years. Dinner passed more easily than Elena expected. She learned that the woman in green was named Priscilla Hart, an old family friend of the bride's parents, and that the 2 men were business associates of Daniel's new father-in-law, a property developer named Charles Whitfield. Alexander, she gathered, was somehow connected to all of them, though he answered questions about himself briefly, redirecting attention with practiced ease whenever the conversation turned toward him. "You do that on purpose," Elena murmured to him at one point, leaning close so only he could hear, "turning the conversation away from yourself." "I find people are more interesting than I am," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "It isn't." As the evening wore on, Elena noticed something curious. Word seemed to spread through the room in ripples, guest by guest, table by table, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly how. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed on her way to the restroom. "The Duke of Davencourt," someone murmured, "spent nearly 20 minutes alone with her, and further along, didn't even know Davencourt was attending. Whitfield must have called in a serious favor." "Duke." The word stopped her mid-step. She turned back toward their table, studying Alexander from a distance as he spoke easily with Priscilla, utterly unbothered by the attention rippling around him. A duke. He hadn't mentioned that on the terrace. He'd simply called himself Ashford, as if that were the whole of who he was. When she returned to her seat, she leaned toward him again. "You're a duke." "I did mention there was a title," he said, not looking up from his glass. "You said it like it was a footnote. To me it mostly is." He finally met her eyes. "Does it change how you see me?" Elena considered the question honestly, turning it over before answering. "It explains why the whole room reorganized itself around you the second you walked me back inside. It doesn't explain why you walked out to that terrace in the first place. Dukes don't usually rescue strangers from their stepmothers." "Maybe this one does," Alexander said simply, and something in his tone told her the conversation was closed for now, though not unkindly. Across the room, Elena noticed her father for the first time all evening, seated near Margaret, his expression unreadable as he glanced repeatedly toward Elena's table. He had said almost nothing to her since she'd arrived, had not defended her when Margaret spoke, had simply watched, the way he always watched, as if hoping the discomfort would resolve itself without his involvement. Elena had stopped expecting anything different from him years ago, but the familiar ache still settled in her chest when their eyes briefly met, and he looked away first. "Your father," Alexander said quietly, following her gaze. "He didn't step in either." "He never does," Elena said, keeping her voice light, though the words carried more weight than she intended to show. "It's easier for him to let her handle things. He calls it keeping the peace. I've always thought it was closer to keeping himself comfortable." Alexander didn't offer false comfort or empty sympathy, which Elena found she appreciated more than she expected. He simply nodded, as if filing the information away, understanding it without needing to comment further. The band shifted into a slower song, and couples began drifting toward the dance floor. Priscilla excused herself with one of the businessmen, leaving Elena and Alexander momentarily alone at the table. "Would you like to dance?" Alexander asked. "Or would you like to stay seated and watch everyone pretend they aren't watching us?" Elena laughed despite herself. "Is that really the choice?" "It rather is." She glanced toward the dance floor, then toward table 14, empty now except for two elderly guests, who clearly hadn't received the memo about where the interesting conversation had moved. She thought of Margaret's face, tight and furious, and something reckless and warm bloomed in her chest. "Let's dance," she said. Alexander led her onto the floor, and Elena was suddenly aware of every eye in the room following them, the way people's gazes seemed to catch and hold as they passed. She had spent the first hour of this wedding trying to disappear into the walls, and now she stood at the center of the room, in the arms of a man half the guests had apparently been hoping to catch a glimpse of all evening. "You're tense," Alexander murmured as they began to move. "I'm being stared at." "You were being stared at an hour ago too," he pointed out. "The difference is that now they aren't laughing." Elena exhaled slowly, letting some of the rigidity ease from her shoulders. He was right. The quality of attention had shifted entirely, from mockery to something closer to curiosity, even respect. It felt strange, wearing that kind of attention after so many years of trying to earn the opposite. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they turned slowly beneath the chandelier. "Of course. Why did you really do this? The terrace, the table, all of it. You don't know me. Dukes don't typically go out of their way for strangers unless there's something in it for them." Alexander was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than evasive. "There is something in it for me," he admitted finally. "Though it has nothing to do with you directly, not at first. My family has been trying to arrange a marriage for me for the better part of 2 years. Tonight, my aunt informed me that Charles Whitfield's niece would be in attendance, and that she expected me to make a good impression." Elena's steps faltered slightly. "So this was a distraction. From another woman your family wants you to marry." "Initially, yes," Alexander said, unbothered by her sharpened tone. "I saw an opportunity to redirect the evening's attention somewhere that felt more honest than another arranged conversation I had no interest in having. But somewhere between the terrace and this dance floor it stopped being only that. How do I know that's true, and not just something convenient to say?" "You don't," Alexander said simply. "Not yet. I'm not asking you to trust me completely tonight. I'm only asking you to consider that not everything done for a practical reason has to remain only practical." Elena studied his face, searching for the calculation she expected to find there, the same kind of performance Margaret excelled at. She found something else instead, something steadier, though she couldn't yet name it with confidence. "That's a very careful non-answer," she said. "I told you earlier," Alexander said, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I'm observant, not always straightforward. Give me time. I imagine I'll become more honest the longer I know you." The song ended, and they stood together a moment longer than the music required before stepping apart. As they walked back toward the table, a tall woman in deep burgundy intercepted them, her smile polished and sharp. "Alexander," she said, "I've been looking for you all evening. Charles has been wanting to introduce you to Sophia." Elena felt Alexander's posture shift slightly beside her, a subtle stiffening she wouldn't have noticed an hour ago but recognized now. "Aunt Lydia," Alexander said evenly. "This is Elena Whitmore. Elena, my aunt. Lydia Ashford." Lydia's eyes swept over Elena in a single assessing glance, the kind Elena had grown painfully familiar with over the years, though this one carried more calculation than cruelty. "Whitmore? The groom's sister?" "That's right," Elena said, refusing to let her voice waver. "How lovely," Lydia said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. She turned back to Alexander. "Sophia has been asking about you. It would be rude to keep her waiting all evening." "I'll find her before the night ends," Alexander said, his tone polite but final. "But for now, I'm with Elena." Lydia's smile thinned almost imperceptibly before she excused herself, moving toward another cluster of guests with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. That was Sophia's aunt, Elena guessed once Lydia was out of earshot. The woman your family wants you to marry. Her family and mine have done business together for 3 generations, Alexander said. It would be, by every practical measure, an excellent match. But I've met Sophia perhaps 6 times in my life, and each time I have left the conversation feeling as though I attended a business meeting rather than spent time with a person I might one day marry. He glanced at Elena. Tonight is the first time in longer than I can remember that a conversation has felt like something other than an obligation. Elena didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, letting the warmth of the statement settle quietly, instead of reaching for a clever reply. As the evening wound down and guests began drifting toward the exits, Daniel finally approached their table, his tie loosened, his cheeks flushed with champagne and happiness. He looked between Elena and Alexander with open curiosity. "I heard something happened earlier," Daniel said, glancing at his sister. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Elena said, and for the first time all night she meant it completely. "Better than fine, actually." Daniel's gaze shifted to Alexander, a question forming, but before he could ask it, Margaret appeared at his side, her hand tightening on his arm. "Daniel, darling, your new mother-in-law wants a photo with the whole family," Margaret said, her voice bright and brittle, though her eyes flicked toward Elena with something colder underneath the brightness. "Come along." Daniel hesitated, glancing back at Elena once more before allowing himself to be steered away, leaving an unspoken conversation hanging unfinished between them. "She's furious," Elena murmured, watching Margaret's retreating back. "She should be," Alexander said. "For years, apparently, she's built her comfort on making you smaller. Tonight, you took up space she didn't grant you permission to occupy. People like that rarely handle losing control gracefully." "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation," Alexander said, "though perhaps also a small warning. Women like your stepmother don't simply accept defeat. I'll try something else before this weekend is over." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, the reality of that settling uncomfortably in her chest. "This weekend isn't over?" "There's a garden brunch tomorrow and a formal dinner tomorrow evening before everyone disperses on Sunday," Alexander said. "Standard wedding weekend arrangements, I'm told." "I hadn't planned on attending either," Elena admitted. "I was going to leave straight after tonight and drive back to the city." Alexander considered her for a long moment. "What if you didn't? What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that you stay through the weekend, that we continue what began tonight, publicly, deliberately. It would accomplish 2 things at once. It would keep my aunt from parading Sophia in front of me at every remaining event, and it would ensure your stepmother has no opportunity to humiliate you again without an audience that has already seen you treated as someone worth attention." Elena studied him, weighing the offer carefully. "You want to pretend. I want to give us both a reason to survive this weekend with dignity intact," Alexander said. "Whether it remains pretend is entirely up to what happens between now and Sunday." It was a strange offer, half strategy and half something gentler underneath it, and Elena knew accepting it meant stepping into uncertain territory with a man she had known for only a few hours. But she thought of Table 14, of Margaret's cruel, practiced smile, of 14 years spent shrinking herself smaller and smaller to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. "All right," Elena said finally, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I'll stay." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, quiet satisfaction mixed with something that looked almost like relief. "Good," he said. "Then let's give your stepmother something worth watching tomorrow." Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the kind she hadn't worn in this family's presence in longer than she could remember. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would not be walking into it as the girl at Table 14 anymore. The garden brunch began under a soft morning sun, long tables draped in white linen, arranged across the manor's back lawn, surrounded by rows of blooming roses that had clearly been chosen to match the wedding colors. Elena arrived wearing a pale yellow dress she had borrowed from a friend the night before, something a little brighter, a little more deliberate than anything she'd packed for this weekend. She spotted Alexander before he spotted her, standing near the drink table in a light gray jacket, speaking with Charles Whitfield with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his place in a room. When his eyes found her across the lawn, something in his posture changed, a subtle straightening, and he excused himself from the conversation to meet her halfway. "You look wonderful," he said, and there was nothing performed about it. No practiced charm, just simple honesty that made her cheeks warm. "I borrowed it," Elena admitted. "I wasn't exactly prepared for a second event." "It suits you better than anything from a boutique would have," Alexander said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" They walked together toward the seating area, and Elena felt, rather than saw, the shift in attention around them, heads turning subtly, conversations pausing and resuming with new interest. It was strange how quickly she had adjusted to being watched with curiosity rather than pity. Margaret was already seated near the center of the largest table, dressed in sharp navy, her expression carefully composed into pleasant hostess mode for the benefit of the other guests. But Elena caught the flicker of tension in her jaw the moment she and Alexander approached, the brief, involuntary tightening around her eyes. "Elena," Margaret said, her voice syrupy sweet, "how lovely you could join us this morning. I wasn't certain you'd feel up to it, after last night." "I feel wonderful, actually," Elena said, taking the seat Alexander pulled out for her, directly across from her stepmother. "Thank you for asking." Margaret's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes calculated quickly, searching for another angle. "Your Grace," she said, turning her attention to Alexander with practiced warmth, "I do hope Elena hasn't bored you terribly. She's always been rather quiet at these sorts of gatherings, not much for conversation." "I've found her conversation quite the opposite of boring," Alexander said smoothly, buttering a piece of bread without looking up, "though I suspect that depends greatly on who she's speaking with, and whether they're actually listening." The comment landed with quiet precision, and Elena saw a flicker of understanding pass through several guests seated nearby, the implication clear without being cruel. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well," Margaret said, recovering quickly, "I suppose we all have our talents. Beatrice, tell the Duke about your work at the gallery. She curated an exhibition last spring that received wonderful reviews." Beatrice launched into an animated description of her gallery work, clearly relishing the redirected attention, while Elena sat quietly, watching the familiar dynamic play out with a strange sense of distance, as though she were observing it from outside herself for the first time. This was how it always went. Margaret found a way to elevate her own daughters while subtly diminishing Elena, and everyone at the table simply accepted it as the natural order of things. Except this time, Alexander listened politely to Beatrice's story, offered a genuinely thoughtful question about the exhibition's theme, and then, without missing a beat, turned back to Elena. "You mentioned last night that you work with children," he said. "Tell me more about that." The table's attention shifted again, and Elena felt a flicker of surprise at how naturally he'd redirected the conversation, not dismissively toward Beatrice, but simply back toward balance. "I run an after-school program," Elena said, finding her voice steadier than she expected, "for children who need extra support, mostly kids whose parents work multiple jobs and can't be there in the afternoons. We help with homework, but also just give them somewhere safe to be." "That sounds like meaningful work," said one of the other guests, an older gentleman Elena didn't recognize, genuine interest in his tone. "It is," Elena said, warming to the topic despite herself. "Difficult, some days, but meaningful." "I imagine it requires far more patience than curating an art exhibition," Alexander said mildly. And though his tone remained pleasant, Elena caught the subtle edge beneath it, a quiet correction of the table's earlier dismissiveness. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Of course, dear," she said to Elena, though the warmth had drained from her voice. "It's very noble, working with children like that." "Like what?" Elena asked, before she could stop herself, the old instinct to shrink and apologize suddenly absent. Margaret blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned. "I only meant children who need extra support. It's very charitable of you." "They're just children," Elena said simply. "They don't need charity. They need someone to show up consistently. That's all any of us really need, isn't it?" The comment hung in the air a moment longer than intended, and Elena wondered if she'd overstepped, but Alexander's hand found hers briefly under the table, a small, steadying gesture that gave her the courage to hold Margaret's gaze without flinching. The rest of the brunch passed with fewer direct confrontations, though Elena noticed Margaret watching her throughout the meal with narrowed, calculating eyes, clearly reassessing whatever strategy she'd planned to employ. When the meal concluded and guests began drifting across the lawn in small groups, Alexander leaned close to Elena. "Walk with me," he said. "There's a section of the garden past the roses that's far quieter." They walked together along a stone path lined with hedges, the sounds of the reception fading behind them, until only birdsong and the soft crunch of gravel remained. Elena breathed in deeply, feeling some of the tension from the brunch table finally loosen from her shoulders. "You handled that well," Alexander said. "Better than I expected, honestly." "I've had 14 years of practice absorbing exactly that kind of comment," Elena said. "I've just never had the confidence to push back before." "What changed?" Elena considered the question seriously before answering. I think, for the first time, I had someone in the room who wasn't waiting for me to fail. That makes a difference, knowing someone actually believes you, even in small moments. Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I do believe you, he said, not just as part of whatever this weekend has become. I've watched you across 2 meals now handle cruelty with more grace than most people I've known my entire life manage in far easier circumstances. Elena felt her breath catch slightly at the sincerity in his voice. You barely know me. I know enough, Alexander said. I know that you gave up your seat at your own family's table without complaint for years, that you still showed up to support your brother, despite how they've treated you, and that even after everything last night, you didn't ask me to fight your battles for you. You only asked to be seen. That's a lot to gather from one dinner and one brunch, Elena said softly, though something in her chest ached pleasantly at his words. I told you, Alexander said, a faint smile touching his mouth. I'm observant. They continued walking, the conversation drifting into easier territory, exchanging small details about their lives, favorite books, childhood memories, the ordinary building blocks of getting to know another person. Elena learned that Alexander had lost his mother young, that his father had raised him with a strict sense of duty that left little room for softness, that the dukedom he'd inherited at 24 had come with more responsibility than celebration. Is that why you understood last night? Elena asked. Why you knew what it looked like, watching someone be diminished? Partly, Alexander admitted. My father wasn't cruel the way your stepmother is. He was distant, formal, always measuring my worth against expectations I never quite met to his satisfaction. It's a different flavor of the same wound, I think. Feeling like you have to earn a place that should have been yours simply by existing. Elena nodded slowly, understanding settling between them like something shared rather than merely spoken. I'm sorry, she said, that you went through that. I'm sorry you're still going through yours, Alexander replied. They reached a small stone bench tucked beneath a flowering tree, and Alexander gestured for her to sit. The garden around them was quiet, the wedding festivities distant enough to feel like another world entirely. Can I tell you something? Elena said, watching a petal drift down from the branches above them. Last night, when you said come with me, some part of me almost didn't follow you. I've spent so long expecting kindness to have conditions attached to it, I nearly walked away instead. What made you stay? You didn't ask anything of me, Elena said. You didn't say come with me and then wait for something in return. You just offered a way out, without conditions. I don't think anyone's done that for me before. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something tender moving across his features. I meant what I said last night, about this stopping being only practical somewhere along the way. I think it stopped being practical the moment you took my arm, and I felt you trembling, and I realized how badly I wanted that trembling to stop, not because it served some purpose for me, but simply because I couldn't stand to see it continue. Elena's chest tightened with an emotion she didn't have a name for yet, something between disbelief and hope. You barely know me, she said again, softer this time. Then let me keep learning, Alexander said. Starting now, starting honestly, without pretending this is only about my aunt or your stepmother anymore. The formal dinner that evening carried a different energy entirely from the previous night. The dining hall glowed with candlelight, long tables set with gleaming silverware, and this time Elena found her name card placed beside Alexander's near the center of the room, a clear, deliberate statement that hadn't required negotiation. Margaret noticed immediately, her expression flickering with poorly concealed frustration as she took her own seat several places down, no longer at the head of attention. Throughout dinner, Alexander remained attentive without being performative, engaging Elena in genuine conversation while also drawing her into discussions with other guests, gently ensuring she was never left isolated the way she had been at every family gathering for years. When dessert arrived, the orchestra began playing something slow and elegant, and couples once again drifted toward the dance floor. Dance with me, Alexander said, extending his hand. Elena took it without hesitation this time, and as they moved together beneath the candlelight, she felt none of the previous night's self-consciousness, only the steady warmth of his hand at her waist and the quiet certainty in his eyes. Your stepmother has been watching us all evening, Alexander murmured as they turned slowly across the floor. Let her watch, Elena said, and meant it completely. Near the edge of the dance floor, Margaret stood with Clara, her expression tight, her arms crossed as she observed the scene with open displeasure. When the song ended and Alexander leaned down to speak quietly near Elena's ear, something private and warm that made her laugh softly, Margaret's composure finally cracked. Elena, Margaret called sharply, crossing the floor toward them with brisk, purposeful steps. "A word, please." Alexander's hand tightened slightly at Elena's back, a silent question asking whether she wanted him to intervene. Elena shook her head slightly, a small gesture of reassurance, and stepped toward her stepmother, meeting her gaze directly, for what felt like the first time in years. "What is it, Margaret?" "A word," Margaret repeated, her voice low and clipped. "Alone." Elena glanced back at Alexander, who nodded once, though his eyes remained watchful as she followed Margaret toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the music and the dancing and the curious eyes that had followed them all evening. Whatever Margaret intended to say, Elena understood instinctively that it would not be kind. But for the first time, walking toward that confrontation, Elena did not feel the familiar dread that usually preceded these conversations. She felt something closer to readiness, the quiet strength of someone who had finally been shown, by a near stranger with careful eyes and a steady voice, exactly what it felt like to be believed. Margaret led Elena to a small alcove near the coat room, away from the music, her expression shifting the moment they were out of earshot from anyone else. The pleasant hostess mask fell away entirely, replaced by something colder, sharper. "I know what he's doing," Margaret said, crossing her arms, "and I think you should know too, before you make a fool of yourself." "What are you talking about?" "The Duke," Margaret said, saying the title like it left a bitter taste. "I made a few calls this afternoon, while you were off walking the gardens with him. It turns out his family has been trying to arrange a marriage between him and Charles Whitfield's niece for nearly 2 years. His aunt has been quite vocal about it at several social functions." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she kept her expression steady. "I already know about that." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised, though she recovered quickly. "Did he tell you he's using you? That whatever this is between you two started because he needed a distraction from the woman his family actually wants him to marry?" "He told me the truth," Elena said, though a small unwelcome doubt had begun creeping through her certainty. "That it started that way. He also told me it stopped being only that." "Of course he'd say that," Margaret said, her voice softening into something that sounded almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. "Elena, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to save you from embarrassing yourself further than you already have this weekend. Men like him don't fall for girls like you. He's a duke. You work at an after-school program and wear borrowed dresses. Whatever attention he's giving you this weekend will disappear the moment it's no longer useful to him." The words landed with practiced precision, striking exactly the insecurities Margaret had spent 14 years cultivating in her. Elena wanted to believe Alexander completely, wanted to hold on to the warmth of the garden bench and his hand at her back on the dance floor, but Margaret's words wound their way into every quiet doubt Elena had tried to ignore since the terrace. "You don't know him," Elena said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "I know men like him," Margaret said. "I know how these things work. Enjoy your weekend, Elena, truly. But don't be surprised when Monday comes and he's back to his real life, and you're back to yours, and none of this ever happened again." Margaret walked away before Elena could respond, leaving her standing alone near the coat room, the distant sound of music and laughter suddenly feeling very far away. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, the doubt Margaret had planted taking root faster than she wanted to admit. She thought about returning to the dance floor, to Alexander's steady presence, but found herself instead slipping out a side door onto a small balcony overlooking the parking area, needing a moment alone to sort through the tangle of emotions Margaret had left behind. The cool night air did little to settle her thoughts. She replayed every conversation with Alexander, searching for cracks in his sincerity, for evidence that Margaret might be right. He had admitted, openly, that this began as a way to avoid his aunt's matchmaking. He had never denied the practical origins of their connection. What if the garden conversation, the honesty about his father, the tenderness in his voice, had all simply been another layer of the same convenient performance? Footsteps approached behind her, and Elena turned, expecting Alexander, but found instead a young woman she didn't recognize, elegant in deep green, watching her with curious eyes. "You're Elena," the woman said. "I'm Sophia, Charles Whitfield's niece." Elena's stomach tightened. "It's nice to meet you." "Is it?" Sophia asked, not unkindly, tilting her head slightly. "I imagine, given the circumstances, meeting me might feel rather complicated." "I don't know what you mean," Elena said carefully. Sophia smiled, though there was no cruelty in it, only a kind of weary amusement. "Lydia has been trying to arrange a marriage between Alexander and me for 2 years. I've met him perhaps a dozen times total. Do you know what those meetings were like?" Elena shook her head slowly. "Polite, distant. He spent most of them checking his watch," Sophia said. "I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because I think you should know. Whatever this is between you two, I've watched him with 100 women our families have paraded in front of him, and I've never once seen him look at any of them, the way he looked at you on that dance floor tonight." Elena's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Margaret told me this weekend was only ever about distracting him from you." "Margaret," Sophia repeated, the name clearly unfamiliar. "Is that your stepmother? The one who made that scene last night?" Elena nodded. "For what it's worth," Sophia said gently, "I don't think you should trust the opinion of someone who tried to humiliate you in front of 200 people the night before. That doesn't sound like someone invested in your happiness." The observation landed with quiet, undeniable clarity, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the tight grip of Margaret's words beginning to ease. "Thank you," Elena said softly, "for telling me that." "I should be thanking you, honestly," Sophia said with a small laugh. "You've single-handedly ended 2 years of extremely uncomfortable arranged introductions. Lydia's going to have to find someone else to torment now." Elena managed a small smile, though her thoughts were still tangled with doubt. Sophia's words had helped, but Margaret's had already done their damage, planting seeds of uncertainty that lingered even now. When Elena finally returned inside, she found Alexander near the edge of the dance floor, scanning the room with visible concern until his eyes found her. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice as he crossed toward her. "I was starting to worry. What did she say to you?" Elena hesitated, the doubt still tangled uncomfortably in her chest. "She told me the truth about why this started, about Sophia, about your family wanting an arranged marriage." "I already told you that myself," Alexander said, confusion flickering across his features. "None of that should be news." "She also said that whatever this is will disappear once the weekend ends," Elena said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended, months of accumulated insecurity finally finding a voice. "That men like you don't fall for women like me, that this has all just been convenient for you, and come Monday, you'll go back to your real life." Alexander's expression shifted, something between hurt and frustration crossing his face. "And you believed her?" "I don't know what I believe," Elena admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I've spent 14 years being told I'm not enough, Alexander. It doesn't just disappear because one weekend went differently." "I'm not asking you to forget 14 years of pain in one weekend," Alexander said, stepping closer, his voice low and urgent. "I'm asking you to trust what you've actually experienced with me, rather than what a woman who has spent years trying to diminish you claims to know about my intentions." "How do I know the difference," Elena asked, "between what's real and what's just another performance?" The question hung between them, heavy and unresolved, and Elena watched something in Alexander's expression close slightly, a careful retreat behind a more guarded composure. "I suppose," he said quietly, "that's something only time can prove, not words spoken in the middle of a crowded room." Before Elena could respond, Daniel appeared beside them, oblivious to the tension crackling between them. "There you two are. Everyone's asking about you both. Come take a photo with the wedding party." Elena glanced at Alexander, searching his face for reassurance, but found only careful distance, the walls he'd lowered throughout the weekend now rising again, brick by brick, in response to her doubt. "Of course," Alexander said, his voice polite but noticeably cooler. "We'll be right there." The photo passed in a blur, Elena forcing a smile she didn't feel, standing beside Alexander, while a careful few inches of distance separated them, where before there had been none. She caught Margaret watching from across the room, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and Elena understood, with sinking clarity, exactly what her stepmother had accomplished. The remainder of the evening passed in polite, careful conversation, the easy warmth of the garden bench and the dance floor replaced by something more formal, more guarded. When the dinner finally concluded and guests began departing, Alexander walked Elena to her car in near silence, the words that needed saying caught somewhere between them, unspoken. "Elena," he said finally as she reached for her car door, "I meant everything I told you this weekend. About the garden, about my father, about what stopped being practical. I want to believe that," Elena said honestly, exhaustion and confusion evident in her voice. "I do, but I need time to untangle what's real from what Margaret planted in my head. I'm sorry." Alexander nodded slowly, disappointment visible despite his effort to mask it. "I understand," he said. "Drive safely." He stepped back, allowing her space to leave, and Elena drove away from the manor grounds with tears finally slipping free, the weekend's whirlwind of hope and doubt catching up to her all at once. She had spent 2 days beginning to believe she deserved something real, something honest, only to watch it slip through her fingers in a single conversation with a woman who had spent 14 years perfecting the art of making Elena doubt herself. Behind her, though she couldn't see it, Alexander stood alone in the manor's circular driveway long after her taillights disappeared into the darkness, his jaw tight, already formulating exactly what he intended to do about a woman named Margaret who had, for the second time in 2 nights, tried to convince someone she loved that they weren't worth loving. 3 days passed before Elena heard from Alexander again. 3 days spent replaying the wedding weekend over and over in her mind, trying to separate what had felt real from what might have simply been convenient timing. She returned to her after-school program, threw herself into helping her students with their homework and their small daily struggles, grateful for the distraction from her own tangled emotions. On Thursday evening, as she was locking up the classroom, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I know I said Monday I would let you have space. I've given you 3 days instead of 1. That's the longest I've managed. Could I see you? There are things I should have said Saturday night instead of letting you drive away with doubt still sitting on your shoulders. Alexander." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to ignore it entirely, to protect herself from the possibility of further disappointment, but a larger part of her, the part that still remembered the warmth of his hand at her back and the honesty in his voice on the garden bench, found herself typing a response before she'd fully decided to. "I'm home this evening. You can come by if you'd like." She sent him her address, then spent the next hour anxiously tidying her small apartment, though there was little to tidy in the modest 1-bedroom space she'd called home for the past 4 years. When the knock finally came, Elena took a steadying breath before opening the door. Alexander stood in the hallway, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, a simple gray sweater replacing the tailored suits from the wedding weekend. He looked slightly uncertain, an expression that felt unfamiliar on someone who typically carried himself with such effortless confidence. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," Elena echoed, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was small, nothing like the manor grounds where they'd spent the weekend, but Alexander looked around with genuine interest, rather than the polite disguise of distaste Elena half expected. His eyes lingered on the bookshelf crowded with well-loved novels, on the small collection of children's drawings pinned to her refrigerator, gifts from her students over the years. "This is you," he said, almost to himself. "This is more you than anything I saw this weekend." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, unsure what to make of the observation. "I don't have anything fancy to offer you. I have tea, and I think some crackers." "Tea would be lovely," Alexander said, following her into the small kitchen. They sat at her small table while the kettle heated, silence stretching between them, heavier than the comfortable quiet they'd shared in the garden days before. Finally, Alexander spoke. "I ended things with my family, regarding Sophia," he said. "Formally on Monday. I told my aunt I would not be pursuing an arrangement with Charles Whitfield's niece, that I had met someone whose company I valued, for reasons that had nothing to do with business alliances or family expectations." Elena's breath caught slightly. "How did that go?" "Poorly, initially," Alexander admitted, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. "My aunt reminded me of 3 generations of business partnership, of duty, of everything I apparently owe the family name. I told her that I had spent my entire life honoring obligations that were never truly mine to begin with, and that I intended to make my own choice, for once, about who I wanted to spend my life getting to know." "That sounds like it cost you something," Elena said quietly. "It did," Alexander said. "My aunt hasn't spoken to me since, but it cost me far less than watching you drive away Saturday night, believing that everything between us had been a performance, would have cost me." The kettle whistled, and Elena rose to pour the tea, grateful for the momentary distraction while she processed the weight of his words. When she returned to the table, she found Alexander watching her with quiet intensity. "I need you to understand something," he said. "What Margaret told you Saturday night, about this beginning as a distraction, that part was true. I won't pretend otherwise. But somewhere between the terrace and that dance floor, and certainly by the time we sat together on that garden bench, it became something I wasn't prepared for, and something I'm not willing to let go of simply because your stepmother recognized exactly which insecurities to exploit." Elena wrapped her hands around her warm mug, absorbing his words carefully. "I want to believe you," she said. "I do. But I've spent 14 years learning that people who seem too good to be true usually are. My own father couldn't be bothered to defend me at my brother's wedding. Why would a duke choose to fight for me when it would be so much easier not to? Because you're worth fighting for," Alexander said simply, without hesitation. "And because I'm tired of watching people who deserve better accept less, simply because no one taught them they were allowed to expect more." Something in Elena's chest cracked open at his words, years of careful self-protection beginning to crumble. "This is terrifying," she admitted quietly. letting myself believe this could be real. I know, Alexander said, reaching across the small table to take her hand gently. I'm not asking you to trust me completely tonight. I'm only asking for the chance to keep proving it, for as long as it takes. They talked for hours that evening, the conversation flowing more easily than either of them expected, moving through childhood memories, difficult family dynamics, hopes neither had spoken aloud to anyone else. By the time Alexander finally rose to leave, well past midnight, something had shifted between them. The careful walls from Saturday night, replaced by something steadier, more grounded in honesty than performance. Over the following weeks, Alexander made good on his promise. He called regularly, visited whenever his schedule allowed, met her students at the after-school program, and spent an entire afternoon helping a 9-year-old named Oliver with his multiplication tables, patient and genuinely engaged in a way that left Elena watching from the doorway with tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. He never once suggested she change anything about her life to fit more comfortably into his world. Instead, he seemed endlessly curious about the world she already occupied, asking thoughtful questions about her work, remembering small details about her students, showing up consistently in ways that slowly, steadily, began dismantling 14 years of learned distrust. 6 weeks after the wedding, Alexander invited Elena to a gathering at his family's estate, the same social circle that had once watched Margaret humiliate her without intervening, the same world that had briefly turned its attention to the mysterious connection between Elena Whitmore and the Duke of Davencourt before moving on to other gossip. Are you sure about this? Elena asked, standing in front of her closet, uncertain what to wear to a gathering of people who moved through a world so different from her own. I'm sure, Alexander said, appearing in the doorway of her bedroom with a small velvet box in his hands. Actually, I was hoping you might wear this. He opened the box to reveal a delicate necklace, elegant but simple, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Elena had glimpsed on other women at the wedding. It was my mother's, Alexander said quietly. She wore it the day my father proposed. I've kept it locked away since she passed, waiting, I suppose, for someone who felt right to wear it. Elena's throat tightened as she studied the necklace, understanding the weight of what he was offering her, not just jewelry, but a piece of himself he had protected carefully for years. Alexander, she whispered. I'm not proposing tonight, he said gently, a small smile touching his mouth, though I imagine that conversation isn't far off, if you'll have me. Tonight, I simply want to walk into that room with you as exactly who you are, no pretending, no performance, and let everyone who once looked past you finally see you clearly. Elena allowed him to fasten the necklace around her neck, her hands trembling slightly, though not with the fear that had gripped her at the wedding months before. This trembling felt different, warmer, closer to hope than dread. The gathering that evening unfolded in an elegant ballroom not unlike the one where Elena had first been humiliated, though this time she walked in on Alexander's arm with her chin held high, wearing his mother's necklace, no longer the girl hiding at table 14. Heads turned as they entered, recognition flickering across several faces, guests who had witnessed the scene at Daniel's wedding months earlier. Lydia approached first, her expression carefully neutral, though something in her posture suggested grudging acceptance rather than open hostility. Alexander, she said. Elena, I understand congratulations may soon be in order. They may indeed, Alexander said, glancing at Elena with warmth that needed no further explanation. Across the room, Elena spotted Sophia, who caught her eye, and offered a genuine, encouraging smile, a silent acknowledgement of the strange path that had brought them both to this unexpected friendship. As the evening progressed, Alexander introduced Elena not as a guest, not as an uncertain addition to his world, but as someone whose presence he clearly valued and intended to keep close. He spoke of her work with obvious pride, mentioned small details about her life with the easy familiarity of someone who had taken the time to truly know her, and never once made her feel like she needed to shrink herself to fit into the room. Later that evening, as they stood together near a wide window overlooking the estate's gardens, Alexander turned to her, with quiet seriousness replacing the evening's lighter conversation. Do you remember what I said to you on that terrace? He asked. Come with me. I remember, Elena said softly. I meant it that night, as an escape from a room that didn't deserve you, Alexander said. I mean it differently now. I'm asking you to come with me, not away from something, but toward everything ahead of us, whatever that looks like, for as long as you'll have me. Elena felt tears gather, warm and unashamed, as she looked up at the man who had, in a single unexpected moment months earlier, changed the entire trajectory of her life. Yes, she said simply, I'll come with you. Outside, The garden lights glowed softly against the darkening sky, and somewhere across the ballroom, the orchestra began a slow, familiar melody. Alexander extended his hand, and Elena took it without hesitation. No longer the humiliated girl from table 14, but a woman who had finally learned, through patience and honesty, and one unforgettable whisper, exactly what it felt like to be seen, valued, and chosen, fully and completely, for exactly who she was. They danced together beneath the chandelier light, and for the first time in her life, Elena understood that the story she had once believed about herself, the story Margaret had spent 14 years writing for her, was never the true one after all. The true story had only just begun, on a terrace, on a night she almost walked away, when a stranger's steady voice offered her a different path entirely. And she had taken it.